The rifle shot echoed across the valley, just as Grace Sullivan noticed the fresh blood trail leading away from her trapline, and she knew without checking that another week's worth of pelts had been stolen before dawn could even break properly over the California mountains. She pressed her palm against the rough bark of a ponderosa pine, steadying herself as anger and desperation warred in her chest. The year was 1883, and Grass Valley had grown from a mining camp into a proper town. But that progress meant nothing when your livelihood disappeared into the hands of thieves who knew the wilderness better than the law ever would. Grace had turned 23 last month, celebrating alone in the cabin her father had built before consumption took him 2 winters past. Her mother had followed him within 6 months, leaving Grace with 800 acres of prime hunting land in the Sierra Nevada foothills and the knowledge her father had spent 20 years teaching her. That knowledge was supposed to sustain her. The pelts from beaver, marten, and fox were supposed to keep her fed through winter and provide enough extra to eventually expand into cattle or horses. Instead, for 3 months straight, her traps had been raided with increasing boldness. Sometimes the poachers took the animals, sometimes they destroyed the traps entirely. Always they cost her money she did not have to lose. Grace checked the next trap and found it sprung but empty, the chain cut clean through with heavy shears. Professional work. These were not opportunistic drifters, but organized thieves who knew exactly what they were doing. She counted 5 more ruined traps before the sun climbed high enough to burn through the morning mist. And by then, her hands were shaking with more than just the November cold. The ride back to her cabin took an hour through dense forest and across 2 creek beds running high with snowmelt from the peaks above. Grace had grown up in this wilderness, had learned to read tracks before she could read books. But lately the woods felt hostile in ways they never had when her father was alive. A woman alone was vulnerable, and everyone from here to Sacramento seemed to know it. She was unsaddling her mare when hoofbeats approached from the southern trail. Grace's hand moved instinctively to the rifle scabbard, but she relaxed when she recognized Tom Chen from the general store in town. He was leading a stranger on a tall roan gelding, and something about the way the newcomer sat his horse made Grace think of coiled steel wire. "Miss Sullivan," Tom called out, his accent still carrying traces of his Cantonese childhood, despite 30 years in California. "This fellow was asking about work. Heard you might need help with your poaching problem." The stranger swung down from his saddle with an easy grace that spoke of years in the saddle. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with dark hair that needed cutting, and eyes the color of creek water over granite. He wore working clothes that had seen hard use but were clean and well-maintained, and the pistol on his hip rode in a holster worn smooth from practice. When he removed his hat, Grace saw a face probably a few years older than her own, weathered by sun and wind but striking in its angles. "Name is Sam Donovan, madam," he said, and his voice carried a trace of Texas Hill country. "Tom tells me you have got trouble with thieves taking your game." Grace studied him with the same careful attention she gave to animal tracks. There was no wedding ring, no telltale line where one might have been removed. His hands were calloused from rope and leather, his boots were made for riding, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his own capabilities. But Grass Valley saw plenty of drifters, and not all of them were trustworthy. "I might have trouble," she admitted. "But I do not know you, Mr. Donovan, and I am not in the habit of hiring strangers based on a friendly introduction." Tom shifted in his saddle. "Sam here helped track down those men who robbed the stage last month. Sheriff Harris spoke well of him. He has been working odd jobs around town for a few weeks, and he has a reputation for being honest." Sam met her eyes directly. "I am not asking for charity, Miss Sullivan. I need steady work through the winter, and you need someone who can watch your trap lines and discourage the men cutting into your income. I will work for room and board, plus a percentage of whatever pelts we can save from the thieves. If I cannot solve your problem within 2 weeks, I will move on, and you will owe me nothing but the meals I ate." It was a fair offer, perhaps too fair. Grace wanted to refuse on principle, hating that she needed help at all, but practicality won out over pride. She had perhaps 6 weeks of savings remaining before she would need to start selling off her father's tools or the breeding pair of horses she had been saving for spring. 2 weeks of feeding a ranch hand would not break her, and if this Sam Donovan could actually stop the poaching, it would be worth far more than his percentage. "The cabin has a small bunkhouse out back," she said finally. "It is not fancy, but it is weatherproof and has a stove. I provide 3 meals a day and coffee. In exchange, you patrol my trap lines, repair what gets damaged, and deal with anyone you catch stealing. If this works, we can discuss more permanent arrangements. If it does not, you leave when I say so, without argument. Fair enough?" Sam extended his hand, and after a moment, Grace shook it. His grip was firm, but not aggressive, and his palm was warm despite the cold air. "I will get my gear and move in today if that suits you." Tom nodded approvingly and turned his horse back toward town. Grace showed Sam to the bunkhouse, a sturdy log structure her father had built for seasonal help that had stood empty since his death. Inside it held a rope bed, a small table with 2 chairs, a potbelly stove, and not much else. Sam looked around and nodded. "I have had worse," he said simply. "What time do you want to head out to check the lines?" "You just got here. Tomorrow morning is soon enough." "Respectfully, madam, if someone is stealing from you, they are doing it on a schedule. The sooner I see the pattern, the sooner I can break it." Grace considered arguing, but recognized the logic. "Give me 20 minutes to pack supplies. We will be out until dusk." She returned to the main cabin and assembled food, water, spare ammunition, and the hand-drawn maps her father had created of the trap lines. When she emerged, Sam had already seen to both horses, checking their hooves and legs with practiced efficiency. He had also produced a battered journal and pencil from his saddlebag. "I am going to keep notes," he explained when he saw her looking. "Patterns are easier to spot when you write them down." They rode out in silence, Grace leading them along a route that covered the northern section of her property. She showed him each trap location, pointing out which had been raided and which remained untouched. Sam examined everything with meticulous attention, occasionally dismounting to study tracks or broken brush. He sketched rough maps in his journal and asked questions about timing, weather conditions, and whether she had noticed any other signs of human presence. "They are working in pairs at minimum," he said, as the sun began dropping toward the western peaks. "One person to handle the animals, another to watch for witnesses. They know your patterns, Miss Sullivan. They are hitting the traps after you check them in the morning, but before you make your evening rounds." "I stopped making evening rounds 3 weeks ago," Grace admitted. "I could not afford to waste the time when the traps were coming up empty anyway." "That is what they were counting on." Sam closed his journal and looked at her directly. "This is not random poaching. Someone is watching you specifically, learning your habits, and timing their thefts accordingly. That means they are either camped nearby or they have someone in town feeding them information." The implication made Grace's stomach tighten. The idea that a neighbor might be betraying her was worse somehow than faceless thieves in the forest. "What do we do about it?" "We change your patterns and we set a trap of our own. But first I need to know if you can shoot that rifle you carry for more than just hunting." Grace met his eyes steadily. "My father taught me to shoot when I was 10 years old. I can hit a quail in flight at 40 yards, and I have dropped a charging bear with 2 shots. If you are asking whether I can defend myself and my property, the answer is yes." Something that might have been approval crossed Sam's face. "Good, because if we catch these men, they are not going to come quietly. Poaching is one thing, but organized theft on this scale usually connects to bigger problems. They might be running pelts across state lines, or they might be part of a larger gang using your land as hunting grounds. Either way, they have money invested in keeping this operation running." They rode back to the cabin as twilight painted the sky purple and gold. Grace made dinner while Sam tended the horses and then joined her in the main cabin's kitchen. She had made venison stew with root vegetables from the cellar, and they ate at the rough-hewn table her father had built when she was a child. The silence was not uncomfortable, but Grace found herself studying her new employee when she thought he was not looking. There was something self-contained about Sam Donovan, a sense that he carried his own counsel and did not need external validation. He ate with neat efficiency, thanked her for the meal, and then surprised her by offering to clean the dishes while she updated her account books. It was a small gesture, but unusual enough to make her wonder about his background. "Where did you work before Grass Valley?" she asked as she recorded the day's losses in her ledger. "Here and there. I grew up on a ranch outside Austin, worked cattle drives through my teens, then spent some years as a deputy in New Mexico Territory. That did not end well, so I have been moving around since then, taking jobs where I find them." Why did it not end well? Sam was quiet for long enough that Grace thought he might not answer. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "The sheriff I worked for was taking bribes from ranchers to look the other way, when they ran homesteaders off disputed land. When I objected, He made it clear I could leave voluntarily or leave in a pine box. I chose the first option, but it meant giving up on a career I had spent 3 years building. That must have been difficult. It was necessary. I cannot abide corruption, and I will not work for a man who profits from other people's suffering. He dried the last plate and set it on the shelf. Your father built a good operation here, Miss Sullivan. The trap lines are well planned, the cabin is solid, and the land is prime territory. I can see why someone would want to take it from you. They will not succeed, Grace said with more confidence than she felt. This land has been in my family for 22 years. My father nearly died twice building this place, and my mother is buried on the hill overlooking the eastern pasture. I will not let thieves take what they worked for. Then we will make sure they do not. Sam picked up his hat from where he had hung it by the door. Get some rest, Miss Sullivan. We will start early tomorrow. After he left, Grace sat alone in the cabin, listening to the night sounds of the forest. Owls called from the pines, and somewhere in the distance a coyote yipped at the moon. She thought about her parents, about the dreams they had carried to California during the gold rush, only to find their fortune in land rather than ore. Her father had been a patient teacher, and her mother had been endlessly optimistic even as illness consumed her. They had believed Grace could manage the property alone, but lately she had begun to doubt that faith. The arrival of Sam Donovan felt like either providence or a test. Grace had learned young that trust was currency in the wilderness, not freely given but earned through action. She would give him his 2 weeks to prove himself, and if he failed, she would find another solution. Surrender was not in her nature. Morning came cold and clear, frost painting the cabin windows in crystalline patterns. Grace was frying bacon and eggs when Sam knocked on the door at first light. He looked alert despite the early hour, and he had already saddled both horses by the time breakfast was ready. I want to check the southern lines today, he said between bites of eggs. If they are hitting different sections in rotation, that is where they will strike next. Grace had been thinking the same thing. They packed quickly and rode out as the sun broke over the mountains, turning the frost to diamonds on every surface. The southern section was farther from the cabin, nearly 3 hours' ride through increasingly rugged terrain. Her father had placed traps along creek beds and game trails where beaver and marten were most active, and the remoteness made it harder to patrol regularly. Sure enough, when they reached the first trap, they found it empty and damaged. The second was the same. But at the third location, Sam held up a hand for silence and pointed to fresh tracks in the mud beside the creek. 2 men on horseback, probably within the last hour. Grace felt her pulse quicken as Sam swung down from his saddle and examined the ground. He moved with absolute concentration, following the tracks upstream for 50 yards before returning to where she waited. They are ahead of us, he said quietly. Maybe half a mile, moving slow because they are checking traps as they go. If we circle around through that stand of pines, we can get ahead of them and see who we are dealing with. They left the horses tied in a sheltered hollow and proceeded on foot, moving as silently as her father had taught her years ago. Sam was even quieter, his boots finding purchase on stone and avoiding dry branches with practiced ease. They worked their way through dense forest until Grace heard voices ahead, rough male laughter that made her jaw tighten with anger. Sam motioned for her to crouch behind a deadfall log, and together they peered through the underbrush at 2 men working one of her trap lines. Both were armed and dressed in well-worn trail clothes. One was young, perhaps 20, with a patchy beard and nervous hands. The other was older, scarred, and moved with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. "And that is 6 pelts today," the younger one said, stuffing a beaver skin into a canvas bag. "The boss will be pleased." "The boss is always pleased when we do the work, and he takes the profit," the older man replied. "But it is good money, and the Sullivan woman does not have the spine to do anything about it. Women should not be trying to run trap lines anyway. This land will be someone else's soon enough." Grace felt Sam tense beside her. Before she could speak, he stood up and stepped into the clearing, his hand resting casually on his pistol. "That land belongs to Miss Sullivan, and you are trespassing," he said, in a voice that carried absolute authority. "Put down the pelts and your weapons, and we can settle this without anyone getting hurt." Both men spun around, the younger one dropping the bag in surprise. The older man's hand moved toward his pistol, but he froze when Grace stood up, with her rifle already aimed at his chest. "My partner asked you nicely," she said. "I am not feeling quite so generous. Those are my pelts you are stealing, and that is my trap you just destroyed. Drop your guns or I start shooting, and at this range I will not miss." For a long moment nobody moved. Grace could see the calculations running behind the older man's eyes, weighing odds and consequences. Finally, he spat into the dirt and carefully removed his pistol with 2 fingers, setting it on the ground. The younger man followed suit, his hands shaking. "You are making a mistake," the older man said. "We work for someone with more money and guns than you can handle. Let us go now, and maybe he will forget about this." "I do not think so." Sam moved forward and collected both pistols, tucking them into his belt. "You are going to tell us who you work for and where we can find him. Then you are going to return every pelt you have stolen from Miss Sullivan, and after that, we are taking you to the sheriff in Grass Valley." "We do not have the pelts anymore. They have already been sold and shipped to San Francisco." "Then you will work off the debt," Grace said coldly. "My father always said a man who steals is a man who has never learned honest labor. You can start by repairing every trap you damaged." The confrontation might have ended there, if not for the sound of more horses approaching through the forest. Sam's expression tightened, and he positioned himself between Grace and the direction of the hoofbeats. 3 more riders emerged from the trees, and Grace's heart sank when she recognized the lead horse. Carl Morrison owned the largest ranch in the county, thousands of acres of cattle land that bordered her property to the west. He was 50 years old, wealthy, and had made no secret of his interest in buying her out over the past 2 years. Grace had refused every offer, and each subsequent proposal had come with thinly veiled implications that a woman alone could not possibly manage a successful operation. "Well now," Morrison said, surveying the scene with cold amusement, "it appears my men have run into some difficulty. Miss Sullivan, I hope you are not planning to do something foolish." "Your men?" Grace kept her rifle trained on the original 2 poachers. "You are behind the thefts?" "I prefer to think of it as recovering resources from land that is being mismanaged. You have proven incapable of running this operation profitably, Miss Sullivan. I have been providing you with opportunities to sell while the property still has value. Consider this encouragement to accept my next offer. You have been stealing from me for months, destroying my livelihood, trying to force me off land my family has owned for over 20 years. Grace heard the fury in her own voice and did not try to control it. That is not encouragement. That is theft and intimidation. And Sheriff Harris will be very interested to hear about it. Morrison's expression hardened. The sheriff is a reasonable man who understands that progress sometimes requires difficult decisions. Women have no business running wilderness operations alone. You should have accepted my previous offers, Grace. Now the price has gone down considerably, and I'm not sure I will be making another one. Then I guess we are at an impasse, Sam said quietly, because Miss Sullivan is not selling, and you are going to call off your men and compensate her for the pelts they stole. Otherwise, this situation is going to get complicated in ways you will not enjoy. Morrison looked at Sam as if noticing him for the first time. "And who might you be?" "I am the man Miss Sullivan hired to protect her interests. You have been stealing from her because she was alone and vulnerable. That situation has changed. One drifter with a gun does not change anything. I have 30 men working my ranch, Mr. Donovan, and every one of them knows how to handle trouble. If you are smart, you will take whatever money Grace is paying you and move along. Otherwise, you might find that accidents happen to people who interfere with my business." The threat hung in the cold air like gun smoke. Grace saw Sam's jaw tighten, but his voice remained calm when he spoke. "I am not smart enough to walk away from a woman being robbed, Mr. Morrison, and I think you are not quite as confident as you are pretending, or you would not have bothered making threats. You could have tried to take us right now, but you have not, which tells me you are not sure how this would play out. So here is what is going to happen. You are going to ride back to your ranch with your men. Miss Sullivan and I are going to take these 2 poachers to the sheriff and file charges. Then we are going to let the law sort out who owns what and who has been breaking it. The law is slow, Mr. Donovan, and accidents are fast. You should remember that." Morrison wheeled his horse and rode away, his men following after collecting the 2 poachers. Sam did not lower his pistol until they were out of sight, and Grace realized she had been holding her breath. "That could have gone worse," Sam said finally. "But it could have gone better too. Morrison is not going to let this stand. He will come back with more men, or he will find another way to pressure you into selling. Let him try." Grace lowered her rifle, her hands aching from gripping it so tightly. "This is my land. and I am not giving it up because some rich rancher decided he wants it. Your land is not worth your life. My life is not worth much if I lose everything my parents built. You do not understand, Mr. Donovan. This place is all I have. It is my home, my income, my future. If I sell to Morrison, I will have some money for a few months, and then nothing. At least here I have a chance." Sam studied her for a long moment. "I understand better than you think, Miss Sullivan. I gave up a career I cared about because I would not compromise my principles. Sometimes the cost of keeping your integrity is everything you own, but you need to know what you are fighting for, and whether it is worth the price Morrison is going to try to extract." They rode back to the cabin in silence, but Grace's mind was racing. Morrison's involvement changed everything. He had resources she could not match, connections that reached into every level of county government, and a reputation for getting what he wanted regardless of legal niceties. Fighting him would require more than just defending her trap lines. It would require a strategy that could counter wealth with something equally powerful. That evening, as she made dinner, Grace found herself watching Sam work on repairing trap mechanisms at her small workshop table. He had good hands, steady and precise, and he worked with the focused intensity of someone who took pride in craftsmanship. When he caught her looking, he smiled slightly. "Something on your mind, Miss Sullivan? I was wondering why you were still here. Morrison made his position clear today. This job just became dangerous, possibly deadly. You do not owe me anything, and you could find easier work in town." "I could," Sam agreed. "But I told you I would help solve your problem, and I keep my word. Besides, I do not much care for men like Morrison, who think money gives them the right to take whatever they want. He needs to learn that some people will not be intimidated. Even if it costs you your life, everyone dies eventually, Miss Sullivan. The question is whether you die for something worthwhile. Helping you keep your family's land seems worthwhile to me." Grace felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. She had been alone for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside her, not because they had to, but because they chose to. It was simultaneously comforting and terrifying. "My name is Grace," she said quietly. "If you are going to risk your life for my land, you might as well call me by my given name." "Sam," he replied, "and I hope we can solve this without anyone risking anything more serious than a few bruises." But hope and reality rarely aligned, and 3 days later, reality arrived with the smell of smoke on the wind. Grace woke before dawn to find the eastern sky glowing orange, and her heart dropped into her stomach when she realized the light was coming from her trap storage shed a half-mile from the main cabin. By the time she and Sam reached it, the building was fully engulfed, flames reaching 30 feet into the dark sky. They saved nothing. 2 months' worth of pelts, all of her prepared traps, and hundreds of dollars worth of supplies burned to ash while they stood helpless with buckets that could not begin to match the fire's fury. When the sun rose, only smoking timbers remained, and Grace sat on the ground, staring at the destruction with dry eyes. "He is escalating," Sam said, his voice tight with anger. "Morrison is sending a message that he can hurt you whenever he wants." "The message has been received." Grace stood up, brushing soot from her clothes. "How do I fight someone who can destroy my livelihood in the middle of the night without consequences? You fight back harder and smarter, and you document everything so that when this goes to court or to higher authorities, you have evidence he cannot deny." They spent the morning photographing the ruins with a camera Grace borrowed from town, and taking statements from neighboring property owners who had seen the fire. Tom Chen agreed to wire the territorial marshal in Sacramento, describing the situation and requesting an investigation into Morrison's activities. It was something, but Grace knew legal processes moved slowly, while Morrison's attacks could come at any time. That afternoon, as she was itemizing her losses for insurance purposes, Sam appeared in the cabin doorway with an expression that made her set down her pencil. "We have a problem. Morrison's men are cutting your fence lines on the western boundary. If they push cattle onto your land, he can claim squatters' rights or agricultural use and tie your property up in court for years." Grace grabbed her rifle and followed Sam to where their horses waited. They rode hard to the western boundary, a 4-mile stretch of fence her father had strung when Grace was 15. Sure enough, 3 sections had been cut, and a small herd of Morrison's cattle was already grazing on her meadow grass. Sam examined the fence cuts with grim efficiency. This was done within the last 2 hours. They are probably watching to see how you respond. Then let them watch. Grace mounted up and began driving the cattle back through the gap in the fence. Sam joined her, and together they pushed the small herd back onto Morrison's land. Then Sam produced a roll of wire from his saddlebags and began repairs while Grace stood guard. "You came prepared," she observed. "I learned to expect trouble when trouble is promised. Morrison is not subtle, which makes him predictable. The question is how far he is willing to escalate before he makes a mistake we can use against him." The mistake came 2 weeks later, in the form of 6 men who rode up to the cabin in the middle of the day. Grace was checking her remaining traps while Sam worked on reinforcing the cabin's exterior walls when the riders arrived. She recognized 2 of them from Morrison's ranch, but the others were strangers with hard faces and well-used weapons. "Miss Sullivan," the leader called out, a lean man with a scar running from his eye to his jaw. "Mr. Morrison sent us to make a final offer on your property. $10,000 cash payment with you off the land within a week. Tell Mr. Morrison the property is not for sale at any price. He thought you might say that, so he asked us to explain your alternatives. You can take the money and leave voluntarily, or we can make your life so miserable that you will beg us to buy you out for half that amount. Fires, accidents, problems with your water supply, threats from drifters. A woman alone cannot defend against all of that indefinitely." Sam appeared from around the cabin's corner, a hammer in one hand. "She is not alone, and your threats do not impress anyone here. Ride back to Morrison and tell him that if he wants this land, he will have to take it through legal channels. If he sends men to intimidate or harm Miss Sullivan, those men will regret it." The scarred man smiled without humor. "Big words from a drifter. Maybe you need a lesson in reality." What happened next unfolded with startling speed. The scarred man reached for his pistol, but Sam's hammer flew through the air and struck the man's wrist with a crack that made Grace wince. The pistol fell to the ground as the man howled in pain. Before any of the other riders could react, Sam had drawn his own weapon and Grace had her rifle trained on the group. "Next person who moves gets shot," Grace said calmly. "You came onto my property to deliver threats. That is trespassing and intimidation. Mr. Donovan just acted in self-defense when your friend drew his weapon first. Now, pick up your injured associate and leave, and be grateful we are not inclined to shoot trespassers on sight the way the law would allow." The riders left, but the scarred man's parting words carried clear across the yard. "This is not over. Morrison always gets what he wants, and you just made it personal." After they disappeared down the trail, Sam retrieved his hammer and examined it critically. "That was foolish of me. I should have just shot him." "You were protecting yourself and me without killing anyone. That was not foolish." Grace lowered her rifle, surprised to find her hands were steady despite the adrenaline singing through her veins. "But you are right that this is not over. Morrison is going to keep pushing until something breaks." "Then we need to make sure what breaks is his operation, not your spirit." Sam met her eyes directly. "I am going into town tomorrow to talk to Sheriff Harris and the territorial judge. There are laws against what Morrison is doing, and if we can get an injunction against him, it might slow him down long enough for the marshal's investigation to come through." Grace wanted to believe that legal remedies would work, but she had seen too much corruption in mining country to trust that justice always prevailed. Still, Sam's determination was infectious, and she found herself hoping that maybe this time the system would work as intended. That night, after dinner, they sat on the cabin's front porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The temperature was dropping toward freezing, and Grace wrapped a blanket around her shoulders while Sam smoked a hand-rolled cigarette in comfortable silence. "Can I ask you something personal?" Grace said after a while. "You can ask. I might not answer, but you can ask. Why are you really doing this? You could have left a dozen times by now. The job you agreed to was protecting trap lines from poachers, not fighting a range war against a wealthy rancher. What makes you stay?" Sam took a long drag on his cigarette before responding. "Honest answer? At first it was just a job, like I said. But then I met you, and I saw what you are fighting for. You are not just protecting land. You are protecting your family's legacy, your independence, your right to make your own choices. That matters. And somewhere along the way, I started to care whether you won or lost. Now it is personal for me, too." Grace felt her breath catch. In the dim light from the cabin window, Sam's face was half shadow, but she could see the sincerity in his expression. She had been so focused on survival that she had not allowed herself to acknowledge the growing warmth she felt whenever Sam was nearby, the way her day felt more complete when she heard his voice or saw him working around the property. "I am glad you stayed," she said quietly. "I do not think I could have faced all of this alone. You have given me hope that maybe I can actually win this fight. You were going to fight regardless of whether I was here. I have just made it slightly less lopsided." Sam stubbed out his cigarette and stood up. "Get some rest, Grace. Tomorrow is going to be a long day." But sleep did not come easily. Grace lay in her bed listening to the night sounds and thinking about Sam Donovan. He had arrived as a stranger, a temporary worker who would drift away when the job ended. Somewhere in the past month, he had become something else entirely, someone she trusted, someone whose presence had become essential. The realization was both thrilling and frightening because caring about someone meant vulnerability, and vulnerability could be exploited. Sam rode into Grass Valley at dawn, and Grace spent the day working on repairs and trying not to worry. He returned in the late afternoon with news that was both encouraging and frustrating. Sheriff Harris agrees that Morrison has crossed several legal lines, but he says his jurisdiction is limited and he cannot move against a man of Morrison's wealth without absolute proof. The territorial judge is willing to issue an injunction if we can provide documentation of Morrison's threats and actions. I have given him everything we have, including witness statements and photographs of the burned shed. He will make a ruling within 10 days. 10 days is an eternity when Morrison is attacking every few days. I know, but it is the best we can get through official channels. In the meantime, I have hired 2 men from town to help patrol the property. They are not gunfighters, but they are honest and they need the work. With 4 of us rotating watches, we can cover more ground and respond faster to trouble. The additional help made a difference. For a week, Morrison's attacks stopped, and Grace began to hope that maybe the threat of legal action had convinced him to back off. Then on the 8th day, one of the hired men came racing back to the cabin on a lathered horse with blood streaming from a gash on his head. "Morrison's men ambushed us at the northern line," he gasped. "They took Jake and said they will not release him until Miss Sullivan signs over the property deed." Grace felt ice water replace her blood. "Where did they take him?" "Morrison's ranch house. They said you have until sundown tomorrow to deliver the deed, or they will hang Jake from his own barn and blame it on rustlers." Sam was already moving, checking his weapons and gathering supplies. "This is kidnapping. Even Morrison cannot explain away a capital crime. Unless he makes sure there are no witnesses who can contradict his story," Grace said grimly. "We need to get Jake back tonight, before Morrison has time to set up whatever story he plans to use." "Grace, this is exactly what he wants. He is trying to force you into a confrontation where he has all the advantages. I know, but I will not let an innocent man die because of me. Jake has a wife and 2 children. If Morrison hurts him, it is my fault for hiring him in the first place." Sam looked like he wanted to argue, but instead he nodded sharply. "Then we do this smart. We are not riding up to Morrison's front door. We are going to scout the ranch, find where they are holding Jake, and extract him without Morrison knowing until we are long gone." They left the other hired hand to watch the cabin and rode toward Morrison's ranch through the gathering darkness. The ranch was massive, covering 5,000 acres with a main house that looked more like a fortress than a home. Outbuildings dotted the landscape, and corrals held hundreds of horses and cattle. Finding one prisoner in all of that would be nearly impossible without luck or information. They circled the ranch from high ground, using Sam's field glasses to study the layout. Grace was about to suggest they move closer when Sam tensed. "There," he said, pointing to a small building set apart from the others. "That looks like a tool shed or storage building, but there are 2 armed men standing guard outside. Morrison would not waste guards on tools." They waited until full dark, then worked their way down the hillside on foot, leaving the horses hidden in a ravine. The shed was 200 yards from the main house, far enough that they might be able to extract Jake without raising an immediate alarm. The challenge was the 2 guards, both alert and armed with rifles. Sam signaled for Grace to circle around to the far side of the building, while he approached from the front. She moved through the darkness with the stealth her father had taught her, each step carefully placed to avoid noise. When she was in position, she gave a soft bird call that Sam had taught her, and immediately heard raised voices from the front of the shed. Grace could not hear what Sam was saying, but his tone was urgent and the guards were responding, moving away from their posts to investigate whatever story he was telling them. The moment they were clear, Grace slipped to the shed door and found it secured with a simple padlock. She used the butt of her pistol to break it, wincing at the noise, and pulled the door open. Jake was inside, tied to a support post with rope, his face bruised but his eyes alert. Grace cut him free and helped him to his feet, just as shouts erupted from the direction Sam had gone. They ran, Jake stumbling but keeping pace, and Grace's heart hammered against her ribs as gunfire cracked through the night. Sam appeared out of the darkness, blood on his sleeve, but moving fast. I had to shoot one of them when they realized I was distracting them. The whole ranch is going to be on alert in about 30 seconds. We need to move now. They ran for the horses, Jake between them, and behind them, Grace could hear Morrison's men organizing a pursuit. They made it to the ravine and mounted up, Jake swinging up behind Sam, and then they were riding flat out through the night, with the sound of pursuit growing louder behind them. The chase lasted 2 hours, a nightmare ride through darkness broken only by moonlight and the occasional muzzle flash when Morrison's men got close enough for a shot. Sam knew the territory well enough to lead them through terrain where horses could travel, but not easily, and gradually they pulled ahead of the pursuit. By the time they reached Grace's property line, the sounds behind them had faded. They made it to the cabin just before dawn, exhausted and shaking with adrenaline. Jake's wife arrived an hour later, summoned by the hired man, and she wept with relief when she saw her husband alive. After they left, Grace collapsed into a chair and put her head in her hands. "Morrison is going to kill us for this," she said flatly. "We broke onto his property, freed his prisoner, and shot one of his men. He will have the law on his side now." "No, he will not." Sam was wrapping a bandage around the bullet graze on his arm, his movements steady despite obvious pain. "Morrison kidnapped a man and held him for ransom. That is a federal crime. The fact that we rescued Jake just means we have a witness who can testify to what Morrison did. Combined with everything else we have documented, this might be enough to bring him down." Grace wanted to believe that, but exhaustion and fear made optimism difficult. She helped Sam finish bandaging his arm, her fingers gentle on his skin, and for a moment they simply looked at each other in the growing morning light. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything you have done, for staying when you should have left, for risking your life tonight, for believing this was worth fighting for." "Grace," Sam's voice was rough with emotion, "you are worth fighting for. Not just the land or the principle, but you. I know this is not the time or place for this conversation, but I need you to know that somewhere in the past month, I stopped thinking of this as a job and started thinking of it as something else entirely. I care about you, and not just as an employer or a friend. If we survive Morrison's next move, I would like permission to court you properly." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Grace felt tears sting her eyes, but they were tears of relief and hope rather than despair. "I would like that," she whispered. "I would like that very much." Sam smiled, the expression transforming his normally serious face into something warmer. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her cheek. "Then, I guess we had better make sure we survive." The territorial judge's injunction arrived the next day, prohibiting Morrison from any contact with Grace or her property, pending a full investigation into his activities. 2 days after that, the federal marshal arrived from Sacramento with a team of deputies and a warrant for Morrison's arrest on charges of kidnapping, arson, theft, and intimidation. The arrest was dramatic, with Morrison protesting his innocence while his own men provided testimony against him in exchange for reduced charges. The trial took 3 months, during which Grace and Sam worked to rebuild her operation. The insurance payment for the burned shed was enough to replace her lost supplies, and with Morrison's poaching operation shut down, her trap lines began producing again. Sam proved invaluable not just as protection, but as a partner who understood the business and suggested improvements that increased efficiency. Morrison was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. His ranch was sold to cover legal fees and restitution, including a substantial payment to Grace for the pelts and equipment he had destroyed. The money was enough to pay off her father's remaining debts and invest in expanding her operation into a legitimate fur trading post that served trappers throughout the Sierra Nevada region. Through it all, Sam remained by her side, and the affection that had sparked during crisis grew into something deeper and more permanent. They spent evenings planning the business and mornings working trap lines together, Sam taught Grace defensive tactics, and she taught him the finer points of fur grading and preparation. They learned each other's habits and preferences, discovered that they worked well as a team, and gradually acknowledged that what had begun as professional necessity had transformed into love. 6 months after Morrison's conviction, on a clear spring morning, with wildflowers blooming across the meadow, Sam asked Grace to marry him. She said yes without hesitation, and they were wed in a simple ceremony at the church in Grass Valley, with Tom Chen and half the town in attendance. Their wedding night was spent in the cabin that had been Grace's family home, and for the first time in years, she felt completely safe. Sam held her with tenderness and passion, and they came together with the certainty of two people who had chosen each other through adversity and trial. The years that followed were not without challenges. The fur trade had its cycles of boom and bust. Winters were harsh, and operating a wilderness business required constant work. But Grace and Sam faced each challenge together, building not just a successful enterprise, but a partnership grounded in mutual respect and deepening love. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Tom Chen, was born in the spring of 1885. Grace had worried about balancing motherhood with running the business, but Sam proved to be a devoted father who insisted on sharing child care responsibilities equally. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter named Margaret after Grace's mother, and the cabin rang with the sounds of childhood laughter that had been absent since Grace's own youth. As their children grew, Grace and Sam expanded the business into a general store that served the trappers and miners working the high country. The store allowed them to trade for furs rather than trapping exclusively themselves, and it provided a more stable income as the fur trade declined in the late 1880s. Sam's reputation for fairness attracted customers from throughout the region, and the Sullivan Donovan trading post became a respected name in the territory. In 1892, when Thomas was 7 and Margaret was 5, they hired additional staff and began taking family trips to San Francisco, showing their children the city where many of their furs were sold. The children delighted in the cable cars and tall buildings, but they always seemed relieved to return to the mountains and forests they called home. Grace never forgot the dark months when Morrison had tried to steal her livelihood and her land. The experience had taught her that strength came not just from independence, but from knowing when to accept help and partnership. Sam had arrived as a stranger offering temporary assistance, but he had stayed and become the foundation upon which she rebuilt not just her business, but her life. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they stood together on the hill where Grace's parents were buried and looked down at the property that had been worth fighting for. The cabin had been expanded into a proper house. The trading post building stood where the burned shed had once been. Their children played in the meadow while employees managed the day-to-day operations that had grown beyond what two people could handle alone. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked, taking Sam's hand. "Giving up your wandering life to settle here?" Sam pulled her close, his arms solid around her waist. "Not for a single moment. I spent years drifting because I had not found anything worth staying for. Then I found you, and suddenly everything made sense. This place, this life, our family, all of it is exactly what I was looking for, even when I did not know I was searching." Grace leaned into his embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "I love you, Sam Donovan. Thank you for protecting my land, but more importantly, thank you for loving me. Always," he promised, and kissed her with the same tender passion that had marked their early days together. As the sun set over the Sierra Nevada mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperate isolation to surrounded by love and family. Her father would have approved of Sam, would have recognized in him the same determination and integrity that had driven him to build a life in the wilderness. Her mother would have loved seeing her grandchildren playing in the meadows she had helped cultivate. The land that Grace had nearly lost had become not just a livelihood, but a legacy, one that she and Sam would pass to their children, along with the story of how they had fought to keep it. It was a story of courage and partnership, of standing firm in the face of corruption and intimidation, and ultimately of love found in unexpected circumstances. Their son Thomas would eventually take over the trading post, expanding it into a successful chain of stores throughout Northern California. Their daughter Margaret would become a teacher, educating children in the growing towns of the Sierra foothills. Both would marry and have children of their own, and the Sullivan Donovan name would become synonymous with honest dealing and community service throughout the region. But all of that was still to come. On that anniversary evening, as Grace and Sam walked hand in hand back to their home with their children running ahead, they were simply two people who had found each other during the hardest times and built something beautiful from the ashes of desperation. The Wild West was slowly being tamed, but here in the mountains they had carved out a space where their love could flourish, where their family could thrive, and where the land her father had claimed decades ago would continue to sustain generations yet to come. Sam pulled Grace to a stop before they reached the house and turned her to face him. In the fading light, his eyes were warm with affection and contentment. "I love you, Grace Sullivan Donovan, today, tomorrow, and for all the years we have remaining." "And I love you," she replied, rising on her toes to kiss him. "Thank you for protecting what was mine and making it ours." They walked the final yards to their home together, their children's laughter welcoming them back, and Grace knew with absolute certainty that every struggle had been worth it. The land, the business, the life they had built, all of it mattered. But what mattered most was the man beside her, the partner who had arrived as a hired hand and remained as the love of her life, the father of her children, and the keeper of her heart. Years rolled by with the steady rhythm of seasons in the mountains. Thomas grew tall and strong like his father, with Sam's quiet confidence and Grace's sharp business instincts. Margaret inherited her mother's determination and her father's sense of justice, often mediating disputes between her brother and the children of their employees with wisdom beyond her years. In 1895, when Grace was 35 and Sam 40, they purchased the land that had once been Morrison's ranch. It had been subdivided and sold multiple times after Morrison's imprisonment, but Sam had carefully bought up parcels over the years, until they owned a continuous stretch from their original property all the way to the western county line. It was a poetic justice that the man who had tried to steal Grace's land ended up providing them the means to expand beyond anything her father had dreamed. They converted Morrison's former ranch house into a lodge for travelers and hunters, creating another revenue stream while preserving the wilderness her father had loved. Sam managed the lodge while Grace ran the trading post, and together they employed dozens of people from Grass Valley and the surrounding communities. The Sullivan Donovan Enterprises became one of the largest employers in the county, known for fair wages and honest practices. The old cabin where Grace had lived alone, where she had faced Morrison's threats and fallen in love with Sam, was preserved as a private retreat. They would sometimes pack up the family and spend weekends there, teaching their children to track and trap the way Grace's father had taught her. On those nights, sitting by the fire in the cabin's main room, Grace would tell stories of the desperate winter when poachers had nearly destroyed everything, and how a cowboy named Sam Donovan had arrived just when she needed him most. "Was it really as dangerous as you make it sound?" Thomas asked one evening when he was 12. Sam and Grace exchanged glances, and Sam nodded for her to answer. "It was worse," Grace said honestly. "There were times I thought I would lose everything, times I was genuinely afraid for my life. But your father showed me that asking for help is not weakness, and that fighting for what you believe in is always worth the cost." "Even if you might have died?" Margaret asked, her young face serious. "Especially then," Sam interjected. "Your mother could have sold the land and moved to San Francisco. She could have given up and let Morrison win. But she stood her ground because this place meant something to her, and I helped because she was worth fighting for. Sometimes the things that cost the most are the things that end up mattering the most." As their children grew older and began making their own ways in the world, Grace and Sam found new rhythms in their partnership. They traveled more, visiting the cities where their furs and goods were sold, attending trade shows and building relationships with merchants throughout California and beyond. But they always returned to the mountains, to the land that had brought them together, and the home they had built from struggle and determination. In 1903, when Grace was 43 and Sam 48, they received word that Carl Morrison had died in prison from pneumonia. Grace felt no satisfaction at the news, only a distant sadness for a man who had let greed destroy his life. Sam suggested they visit Morrison's grave, and Grace agreed. They stood together in the prison cemetery and said a prayer for a man who had been their enemy, but who had inadvertently brought them together. "I forgive you," Grace said quietly to the grave marker. "You tried to take everything from me, but in the end, you gave me something more valuable than land or money. You gave me the circumstances that brought Sam into my life, and for that, I am grateful." Sam squeezed her hand, and they walked away from the cemetery toward the future that stretched bright before them. Their grandchildren began arriving in 1907, when Thomas married a schoolteacher from Sacramento, and welcomed a son the following year. Margaret married a lawyer from San Francisco in 1910, and her first child was a daughter with Grace's green eyes and Sam's dark hair. Grace and Sam embraced grandparenthood with enthusiasm, spoiling the children and teaching them the same wilderness skills they had passed to their own children. The world was changing rapidly as the 19th century gave way to the 20th. Automobiles began appearing on the roads, electricity reached Grass Valley, and the wild frontier of Grace's childhood was transforming into settled civilization. But in the mountains where the Sullivan Donovan properties sprawled across thousands of acres, something of that original wilderness remained, preserved by a woman who had refused to surrender and a man who had helped her fight. In 1920, at the age of 60, Grace was diagnosed with a heart condition that forced her to slow down. Sam, now 65, took over more of the business operations while Grace focused on writing a history of their lives and the early days of Grass Valley. Her memoir, published in 1922, became a regional bestseller and introduced a new generation to the challenges and triumphs of frontier life. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1924 with a massive party at the lodge that drew friends and family from throughout California. Thomas gave a speech honoring his parents' partnership, and Margaret read a poem she had written about their love story. Standing before the assembled crowd, Sam pulled Grace close and kissed her with the same tenderness he had shown 40 years earlier. "You are still the most beautiful woman I have ever known," he whispered in her ear, "and I would do it all again. Every fight, every struggle, every moment, just to end up here with you." "We built something good," Grace replied, tears streaming down her face. "Something that will last long after we are gone." Grace Sullivan Donovan passed away peacefully in her sleep on a spring morning in 1928, surrounded by her family in the house Sam had expanded from her father's original cabin. She was 68 years old and had lived to see her grandchildren grow into capable young adults who carried forward the values she and Sam had instilled. Her last words to Sam were simple: "Thank you for the life we made together. I have loved every moment." Sam lived 3 more years, managing the businesses with Thomas's help and spending time with his grandchildren. He never remarried, telling anyone who asked that he had found his perfect match in Grace and saw no reason to look for another. On the anniversary of Grace's death in 1931, Sam was found sitting on the hill above their home, looking down at the land they had fought to preserve. He had died peacefully, a small smile on his face, and in his hand was a pressed wildflower from the meadow where he had first told Grace he loved her. They were buried side by side on that hill, next to Grace's parents, overlooking the property that had been worth fighting for and the legacy they had built together. The inscription on their shared headstone was simple: Grace Sullivan Donovan, 1860-1928. Sam Donovan, 1855-1931. Partners in life and love. They fought for what mattered and built something beautiful. The Sullivan Donovan Trading Post operated for another 50 years, managed by their descendants before finally closing in the 1980s as modern commerce made such enterprises obsolete. But the land remained in the family, thousands of acres preserved as a reminder of 2 people who refused to surrender, who found love in adversity, and who proved that sometimes the things worth having are the things you fight hardest to keep. Their great-great-grandchildren still visit the property, hiking the same trails Grace and Sam walked, swimming in the same creeks, and listening to stories about the woman who nearly lost everything and the cowboy who helped her save it. The old cabin stands restored and maintained, a museum to frontier life and a testament to the power of partnership, determination, and love. And on quiet evenings when the wind moves through the pines and the sun sets over the Sierra Nevada mountains, those who know the story say you can still feel the presence of Grace and Sam, walking their land together, protecting what they built, and proving that some loves are strong enough to echo through generations. Their story became legend in Grass Valley, told and retold until it was difficult to separate fact from embellishment. But the core truth remained. A woman had stood alone against powerful enemies who wanted to take her livelihood, and a cowboy had arrived to help protect what was hers. Together, they had fought corruption and won, had built a life and a legacy, and had loved each other with a depth and constancy that inspired everyone who knew them. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the money or the land or the business success, though all of those were significant. What mattered was that two people had found each other during the hardest times, had chosen to stand together against impossible odds, and had built something beautiful from courage and love. Grace Sullivan and Sam Donovan had lived the kind of life that made for good stories, the kind of love that people aspired to find, and the kind of partnership that changed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone around them. They had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger, had faced loss and had created abundance, had known desperation and had found joy. And when their story was told around campfires and dinner tables, in classrooms and historical societies, the message was always the same. Sometimes the most valuable things in life are worth fighting for. And sometimes the help you need arrives exactly when you need it most, wearing a cowboy's hat and carrying a determination to stand beside you no matter what comes. That was the legacy of Grace and Sam Donovan, written in the land they preserved, the businesses they built, the children they raised, and the love they shared. It was a legacy that would endure long after the last person who remembered them had passed away, carried forward in the values they embodied and the example they set. In the Wild West of 1883, when Grace Sullivan faced losing everything to poachers and thieves, she could not have imagined the life that lay ahead. But because she refused to surrender, and because Sam Donovan chose to stay and fight beside her, they created something that transcended their individual lives and became part of the fabric of California history. Their story was one of courage and love, of justice and partnership, of struggle and triumph. It was a story that began with theft and desperation, but ended with abundance and joy. And it proved that sometimes the best things in life come from the hardest challenges, and the truest love emerges from standing together when everything else is falling apart. Grace and Sam Donovan had lived that truth, had embodied it in every choice they made and every challenge they faced. And in doing so, they had created a love story for the ages, one that would inspire generations to fight for what they believed in, to stand firm in the face of injustice, and to never underestimate the power of two people who choose to face the world together. That was their gift to the future, not just land or money or business success, but the example of a life well lived, a love deeply felt, and a partnership that proved stronger than any obstacle. It was a gift that would continue giving long after they were gone, carried forward by everyone who heard their story, and was inspired to create their own legacy of courage and love. And so, the story of Grace Sullivan and Sam Donovan became part of the mythology of the American West, a reminder that the frontier was tamed not just by cowboys and lawmen, but by ordinary people who found extraordinary strength in partnership and love. Their names lived on in the land they preserved, the businesses they built, and the family they created, proving that some stories never really end but continue echoing through time, inspiring each new generation to stand firm, fight fair, and love deeply. In the mountains of Northern California, where the Sierra Nevada rises toward the sky and the forests stretch for miles in every direction, the legacy of Grace and Sam Donovan remains written on the land itself. And when the wind whispers through the pines and the sun sets in blazing glory over the peaks, those who listen carefully can still hear the echo of their love story, reminding us all that the things worth having are always worth fighting for, and the best partnerships are forged in adversity and strengthened by time. That was the final truth of their lives. That love, real love, is not just passion or romance, but partnership and determination, standing together when everything else falls apart, and building something beautiful from the ruins of what was almost lost. Grace and Sam Donovan lived that truth every day of their 40 years together, and in doing so, they created a legacy that would outlast buildings and businesses, and even memory itself. Their story was complete, their love fulfilled, their partnership honored through generations. And that was the greatest success of all, not surviving against impossible odds, though they did that. Not building a business empire, though they accomplished that too, but finding each other in the darkness, choosing to stand together, and proving that love combined with courage could overcome any obstacle and create something that would last forever.